because the practice that I see when I talk about this topic doesn't comply with what I have always talked about. But today, and at this time of our life, it has come to be very clear that what I used to talk about many years ago is now in practice. When we talk about democracy, dear brothers and sisters, in general, the majority of the people, the first thing that clicks to their mind when you say the word democracy, the first thing clicks to the mind is freedom. People make synonymous words between democracy and freedom. And from freedom, you become to get subtitles. The freedom of speech, the freedom of criticism, the freedom of choice, the freedom of expression, and then human rights, and so on. But those are the major, a few subtitles that comes out from the word democracy and the umbrella that goes underneath, which is freedom. When we look in the dictionary, you can pick up any dictionary, an English dictionary, and try to find out the definition of democracy. You will see one sentence. One sentence, and I'm sure, if I'm not wrong, a lot of us don't know that sentence, because the majority of the people believe that democracy is synonymous with freedom. But in actuality, democracy in definition and by definition means the rule of the people, by the people, for the people. That's all what you see. So when you look underneath, you don't see any of those subtitles that are under the umbrella of freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of criticism. They don't come along in the definition of democracy. So the sponsors, these freedoms, dear brothers and sisters, were way decades and centuries before the word democracy came into living. The freedom of choice is as old as centuries. The freedom of criticism is as old as centuries, especially if you take a look at it in the Islamic point of view. The freedom of choice was there. The freedom of criticism was there, and it was practiced by Islam and by the Muslims many years ago. So these subtitles are not something new. However, the sponsors and the promoters that promote democracy, to make it palatable, to make democracy palatable and to make it acceptable, especially, this is very important to learn, very important to learn, especially the Muslim world. This democracy, because the Muslims were used to a different way of ruling. We have practiced mubaya'ah, which means the pledge of allegiance. After someone is being chosen, the Muslims give him allegiance. And I don't want to talk how the ruler of Islam is being chosen. We can talk about that if we had enough time after the Halaqa. But the Western world, the civilized, between parentheses, the people who are called them the Western civilized world, they came up with democracy because all what they had at the time and for many centuries is dictatorships. And beyond dictatorships, they gave their people hardships. You know, in Islam, at sometimes we had inherited rulers but we didn't have all the hardship with the people. So we don't want to talk into that, but this is something to keep in the mind of us. For the sake of our Halaqa today, just for the sake of Halaqa, and for the sake of the argument that we are going to talk about, I'm going to assume the assumption of this democracy and everything that is associated with it, even though it has nothing to do with it, but I'm going to assume democracy is associated with the freedom of choice, the freedom of criticism, and so on, in the theoretical term. In other words, let's assume in theory democracy is what the sponsors promotes and say to us. So they are promoting democracy, we have the freedom of choice, and remember again, this is all directed toward the Muslims. And in practice, in theory, it is perfect, beautiful, mashallah. You know, democracy, the freedom of criticism, the freedom of expression, the freedom of the choice. In theory, it's beautiful, acceptable, palatable. People accept it right away. Because a lot of people, especially nowadays, in the Muslim world, those freedoms between parentheses are almost not existent, are almost non-existent. In all types of governments, we have capitalism, we have republics, we have communism. These are all types of governments, dear brothers and sisters. Capitalism, republic, communism, we have democratic states, we have kingdoms, we have emirates. These are all acceptable forms of government in the democratic, civilized world. But when it comes to form an Islamic state, that is a no-no. So the freedom of your choice is not acceptable. You see, when Afghanistan wanted to become an Islamic state, they declared war. Let's take Afghanistan aside. Let's go with the theory of democracy. In Algeria in the 90s, through election, the way the civilized world, between parentheses, they want to choose the ruler. In Algeria, in the 90s, the Muslims, or the population, let's say, it chose the Islamists to rule them. I don't know if people are old enough to remember, those are old enough, they can remember that the Muslims in Algeria chose the Islamists to rule them. Did they allow them? No. Hamas in Palestine, in Gaza, when the people, the population, chose Hamas through election, you know, going to the polls, and you want to choose freedom of choice, freedom of picking your ruler, they picked the Muslims, the Islamists. But that's a no-no. It was not acceptable. So they fought it, and they are still, till now, fighting them all along. More importantly, nowadays, we have, you know, for those who are old enough, these freedoms, they've been talked about for decades. This year, everything falls apart. Everything falls apart. All that theories that we have been hearing about, the freedoms of this and the freedoms of that, when it came to Gaza, when it came to Gaza, a lot of things fall apart. People talk about human rights. You know, for 9 months, we've been hearing the United States administration, particularly Blinken, for 9 months, he was talking about increasing the humanitarian aid to the Gaza people for 9 months. Anybody believe that that happened? It didn't happen. It just talk. So the theory is for us, the application for them, which means when these freedoms and these rights fits their agendas and fits what they are promoting, then they put it into practice. But when it is against their ideas, then they don't put it in practice. They have been, as we know, Ukraine war. Immediately in the Ukraine war, the Russians are the invaders and the Ukrainians are the victims, and they have the right to defend themselves and to defend their people. When it came to Palestinians, the occupier becomes the victim, and he has the right to defend himself. And the occupied and the dispossessed, he became the aggressor and the terrorist. So we have to learn that all these titles that we hear about, these are only titles, and they always tell you things with no application. You always, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, يُرْضُونَكُمْ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَتَأْبَى قُلُوبُهُمْ وَمَا تُخْفِي صُدُورُهُمْ أَكْبَرُ. They always try to give you good talk, you know, nice talk. You know, we are with you, we are going to help you, we are going to increase the aid to Gaza. But we don't see anything, just words, just words. So it is important to learn from these dear brothers and sisters that this democracy that we're talking about and we hear about so often, even in this country, let's take it outside, even in this country, do the people of this country have the same rights? Are the American, black Americans have the same rights and application of these rights as the white American? Do we, as Muslims here, you know, when we criticize, if you remember in the past decade or so, there's always criticism about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and about Islam, and it is Sharia, and the attack always happening against us. And when the Muslims rise up, they say, no, 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 this is the freedom of speech. They have the right of speech. But when we try to condemn or to criticize a certain group or a certain country or a certain elite, then you are always labeled as an anti-so-and-so. And in some cases, you could be criminalized. So we can see always the double standards, the double standard of this democracy that we hear about so much often and often, and it is only when it comes to their benefits, then they will put it in practice. But when it's against their agenda, then they will shut an eye on it and make it as if something doesn't exist. Even sometimes they don't acknowledge. For example, for 9 months, dear brothers and sisters, we hear, you know, in the Gaza war, everybody talking about the prisoners that are, from the Zionists at Gaza. Everybody wants the release of the prisoners from Gaza. Did we hear anybody talking about the thousands of prisoners who are in the jails of the Zionist state? No. This is this double standard. If you want a release of a hostage or a prisoner, then you should talk about both. You don't just mention one thing and you ignore the other part that are the same, even before they were taken, before even the hostages that are now in Gaza. So it is important for us, dear brothers and sisters, to keep our ears open and our eyes open. Not everything we hear is the truth. And a lot of times they say some things that they want us to hear, but in reality and in practice doesn't exist. And this is why I chose this topic, the theory of democracy and what comes with it. And when it comes to application and practice, it really doesn't exist. It really doesn't exist unless those who are promoting it and those who are sponsoring it fits their agenda. When it doesn't, then it makes no sense to them. And I end with this, and I hope I got my point across to you, because, and I think it is a very important thing to learn. I give you an example again. Now we are embarking on voting. In a few months, there's a presidential voting. Well, this is your right of expression. Who are we going to vote for? Who are we going to vote for? Is it the lesser evil? Some people talk about the lesser evil. An evil is an evil, whether this big or this big. He's an evil. What are we going to do? Anybody has a solution? So we need to work on something. We need to work on something. When it comes to these two parties, we are on the same level, whether we like it or not. We need to create a new or follow a new agenda, someone else beyond these, because this is my being here for 47 years. I have been noticing it for 47 years. Oh, alhamdulillah, I never voted. And I will not. Because I myself believe they are both evils. Evils. Whether for the inside or the outside. This is my, and I have felt that in person. So inshallah, let us work on something. Let us, this ummah, work on something new. And there are new ways coming out. A lot of people are being tired of these two lines and are trying to create a new line. So we hope we will accomplish something, because now on the local level, we can do a lot. We need to focus on the local level. We can focus on the local level. But on the higher level, we're still far behind. Wallahu alam. I say what I say, and I ask Allah forgiveness, and hopefully I didn't go too long with you. Jazakumullah khair. If there's anybody have any question, I am inshallah ready to answer. You're laughing. إن شاء الله we'll make دعاء. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت واقضي واصرف عنا برحمتك شر ما قضيت إنك تقضي بالحق ولا يقضى عليك تباركت ربنا وتعاليت. اللهم انصر الإسلام والمسلمين وأذل الشرك والمشركين ودمر أعداءك أعداء الدين بقوتك وعزتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم كن مع إخواننا في غزة يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم كن معهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم كن معهم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اشف مرضاهم وداوي جرحاهم وتقبل شهداءهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. عباد الله، إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.